one probably since before any of us were born, and basically convincing people that he is, God's gift to mankind, or to the Libyans, or in Egypt, or in Syria, or in, we can go on over every country, but I'm more interested in the whole situation itself than listing each one of those countries specifically. Another sign that you'll notice in these countries or those systems would be the widespread corruption that exists. A corruption that feeds the people who benefit from the dictatorship, so they can can sustain it, basically. So if you go to any country, not everyone is poor, by the way. You'll always find a class of people who benefit from that dictatorship. Maybe business people, maybe relatives and family members of that person or that family in power, while the rest of the people suffer. So you will notice usually corruption and the existence of a gap between the rich and the poor. It's an ever-growing gap. What are the root causes of such systems? And that is an important part for us to understand. The root causes, obviously, at least in modern history, in modern times, begin with the decline in the intellectual, economic, social, and political conditions of those countries, especially in the last few years of the Ottoman Empire. Most of these countries actually were either directly under the Ottoman Empire or subject to the influence of that empire that ruled. There is no doubt that during its rule there were a lot of high points in the Ottoman Empire, but towards the end of that Ottoman Empire there was a decline, increase in corruption, and lack of emphasis on education, political freedoms, and so on. That led the beginning of the decline. Then immediately after the decline of and the ending of the Ottoman Empire, colonial powers took over. Basically when you talk about colonial powers, you're talking about France, Britain, Portugal in certain areas, but specifically France and the UK were the two countries that ruled or inherited basically the countries which were, or the land which was under the Ottoman Empire. And through the famous agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that region was divided into dozens of countries, Arab countries and other countries. The only country that was allowed to be independent immediately was Turkey. And Turkey became a separate country, but then you had the creation of a new geography in that region, divided into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and so on and so forth. Many of the Gulf countries might not have been directly under the Ottoman Empire, but also were under British rule. So most of these countries fell under the colonialists. Colonialists, when they take over a country, their goal is to make sure that the resources of that country continue to benefit the colonialist country, whether it's France or the UK. They had no interest in creating a system of democracy, training people to be free, people to be activists. Basically, it was a one-way street. Anything to benefit the colonialist power, and I invite you to read more about it. Now, right after the colonialists had to leave because of the international law, because of the pressure from the US actually, our President Wilson was one of those, countries were given the right of self-determination. And the colonialists were forced to leave one year after the other. In the mid-40s, right after World War II, in 45, 46, until the 50s, and maybe sometimes early 60s, France and the UK had to leave those countries one after the other. And after allowing those countries to be free, colonialist countries made sure that they established or set up governments that were supportive of the colonialist countries. So when they left Syria or Lebanon or Jordan or Palestine, they made sure that whatever they established were governments, corrupt governments, that will actually report to the colonialist powers. To make sure, again, without physically being there by force, they still benefit. France and the UK can still benefit from the influence, from the resources, from the bases, military bases, and so on. In the neo-colonialism era, there was as you all know, anybody remembers what happened after World War II? There was the Cold War era, where it was the conflict between the East and the West as Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, between basically the US, NATO side, and the Warsaw, or basically the communist side. Although there weren't too many direct conflicts, military ones maybe in Vietnam and other areas, the Koreas, what happened is that there was an era of Cold War, where there was a fight, a struggle over influence. So the Soviet Union would help establish countries that are pro-communist or communist in Eastern Europe, for example, in Africa and in the Middle East. Countries that would come to your mind, for example, would be Egypt, Syria, Libya, that were part or sided with the Eastern Bloc. And then there were governments that were supported by the US. And unfortunately, both sides justified supporting dictatorships. Basically, the argument is the ends justify the means, meaning it's okay to establish dictatorships as long as we keep the communists away, and vice versa. The communist countries will say it's okay to justify dictatorships because that will keep the American imperialists away, and so on and so forth. Both try to establish areas of influence. I mean, you think of Czechoslovakia at that time, you think of Poland, you think of Romania, Ceausescu, you think of the Philippines, you think of course, most of the Arab countries, where the influence between the East and the West, or between the communist bloc and the NATO bloc, or the pro-American, pro-European, Western European bloc, as seen. You know, you think of course, South and Latin America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, you think of Chile, Pinochet. So think about these countries and how we justify, as much as the communist side did, we also here in the West justified supporting dictatorships in order to keep the communists away. By the end of the Cold War, with the dismantling and the end of the communist system in the Soviet Union, we moved from a bipolar world to a monopolar world, basically, solo polar world, and that is a world in which there is only one superpower, and that is the US, that is us. The new objective was to keep the status quo, basically keep countries as they are. Don't create any changes. And three goals came as important to various US administration, whether it's Republican or Democratic. It kept, you know, from the mid-90s, late 90s to now, actually the same policies continued. Three things were kept in mind in order to keep the status quo. Basically, keep the flow of oil secure, because those countries in the Middle East are extremely important. Whether it's Iraq, it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, etc. It was important to keep those governments in power, no matter how much we knew they were dictatorships or undemocratic, or how much they abuse human rights. It was important to keep them in power because they ensured that we have secure or preferential access to the oil. For example, that's why when Kuwait was invaded, suddenly we remembered how important the democracy of Kuwait is. So we went there and committed 500,000 soldiers to go and liberate the great democracy of Kuwait, which until recently didn't even have a constitution, and until only recently started allowing women to vote. But that is not important, because women are only important in Afghanistan. But in Kuwait they're not important, because we went to Afghanistan to liberate the women. Although the status of women is not much better now. But again, this is where we bring moral arguments in a fake way to justify wars. The same reason why we invaded Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, for example, was when we felt we don't have that access to that oil from Iraq, when the dictator of Iraq started acting solo, meaning he refused to be our bad guy. So as long as they act like our bad guy, we're okay with it. The minute someone starts thinking that they are an independent bad guy, then we remember that this bad guy is such a bad guy that we should be replaced by another bad guy who reports to us. So it is important to look that the first goal is really, unfortunately, foreign policy towards the Middle East had been impacted by the way we perceive that this oil is ours, but God put it in somebody else's land. unfortunately,